Her prints were all over it. That was another thing that threw us off, for it wasn't far from the body that we found that key to the chest and its chain. We didn't announce that, but it was there all right, looked as though it had been buried and the rain had uncovered it. But there it was. As for the prints of those heels, well, they looked pretty fresh, but by the time we'd got there women had been swarming all over the place. They might be important and they might not. Just one of those things. For, although we didn't know it at the time, the search had finally revealed between where the body lay and the Talbots' old stable, 2 or 3 prints of a high French heel. Just such heels as Helen Wellington and Mrs. Dalton wore as a matter of habit, and as I myself used now and again in spite of Mother's protests and as a small assertion of independence. The police made molds of them, spraying them with some sort of liquid shellac first, I believe, and then pouring in some melted paraffin. The earth was fairly firm and the molds successful, but they offered no characteristics of any sort to identify them. As the inspector said with disgust, there were at least 4 women along the crescent, including the housemaid Peggy, who could have made those prints. But there were about 100,000 in the city who could have made them too. We knew nothing of this on that Monday, however. All we knew was that Emily Lancaster had been killed, and that our morale had for the second time been pretty completely shattered. We carried on as best we could. Monday is the Crescent's wash day, and murder or no murder, at or before 9 o'clock its various laundresses converged on it as usual. By 11 that day the drying yards revealed as usual to all and sundry the most intimate garments of its owners, and inside our houses we were calling up the butcher and ordering soap from the grocer, much as we always had. Not quite as usual, however, for about the middle of the morning the Talbots' laundress, setting the pole for her clothesline into its cement foundation in the drying yard, was unable to seat it properly and made an examination of the hole. The empty shell was lying in it, and with the aid of a clothespin she got it out. But here is one of the things which I dare say has hanged an innocent man before this, or sent him to the chair. All our laundresses are negresses, and of a grade which has an almost superstitious fear of the police. Amanda therefore put the shell in her pocket and said nothing about it. "I didn't want to get mixed up with that kind of trouble," was her later explanation. This, when we learned it, seemed definitely to fix the position of the killer on that Sunday night as in the Talbot drying yard, a small piece of ground which borders the path toward the Lancasters, and which is protected from the street by an open lattice covered with vines. On the side toward the garage and the path, however, there is only shrubbery, and rather low shrubbery, at that. We knew nothing of Amanda's discovery that day, however. Mother spent most of it at the Lancasters, with Mrs. Talbot there also, and reported on her return that Mr. Lancaster was still unconscious and Margaret going about in a daze. She had, it seemed, decided to clear her mother's bedroom of its personal belongings, and so the three women had unlocked the room and gone to work. Mother was hot and tired when she came back, and I noticed that she carried a square package of some sort which looked like a large book. She said nothing about it, however, and as it was wrapped in white paper and tied, I did not ask her about it. In fact, I quite forget about it until that evening when by ones and twos the neighbors drifted in. The package was on top of one of the bookshelves, and it was Mrs. Talbot who noticed it. "I see she gave it to you." "Yes," Mother said. "She didn't know what to do with it." "I don't know that I do, either. I suppose it will go to the third floor." To the third floor is Crescent usage for any sort of storage. I cannot remember now that anyone except Mrs. Talbot showed any interest in the album. There was a time coming when I was to think back and try to recall that scene, but without result. George wanted to see it, to cheer him up, and was sharply rebuked by his mother. Brian Dalton eyed it and then looked away, while his wife watched him. But that was all. I myself knew it well, its imposing size and the clasps which fastened it. I could remember it lying on the Lancasters' parlor table when I was a small girl, and the awe with which I examined the strange clothes and stranger attitudes of the people pictured inside. But now as I say it aroused no interest. We sat in an informal circle, much as we had once before, but the excitement of Thursday had given place to a strained anxiety which showed itself in Mrs. Talbot's lowered voice and strained mouth, in Lydia's pallor and the hands which shook over her knitting, in Mrs. Dalton's shrill high laughter, and in Brian Dalton's increased taciturnity. So far as I can recall, he spoke only once all evening. "What it comes to is this," he said. We have a murdering killing brute somewhere around us, and I've already asked for extra police protection. Police, said Mrs. Talbot. We've been overrun with them, and what good are they? What we need is more bars and more locks. And more fires out back, said Mrs. Dalton surprisingly. Everyone looked at her, but she only laughed rather maliciously, and on that the bell rang and Helen Wellington came in. She stood in the doorway surveying us with her faintly ironic smile. Well, she said, I suppose you think that Jim has been busy again. That shocked us into action. Bad taste always does. Perhaps she had meant to do just that, for Mother got up and faced her squarely. Really, Helen? She said. If you think we have been discussing Jim in this tragic connection, you are mistaken. We have done nothing of the sort. Discussing or thinking or just plain wondering, I came in to tell you what I have told the police.